Hello, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene. The scene is set. Picture a wide river, murky water disguising anything below the surface from being detected. On top, calm yet turbulent remnants of the strong current below show that underneath lies an intricate network of submerged debris and detritus. The low hum of an engine breaks the silence as something, no, hundreds of things break the surface in an attempt to flee from danger. Hundreds of large, oblong fish fly through the air. Below the surface, even more make an escape. These are no native fish, however. These are an introduced species colonizing this once quiet ecosystem. And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 1 of the Anthropocene. So, how are you doing today, Kirsten?
Today I'm doing pretty well. How is it up there in the snow?
Well, we had a 0% chance of snow today, so naturally it is a virtual blizzard outside. Thank you, Great Lakes weather patterns.
Excellent. Sounds exciting.
Yes.
So,
So, I want to ask you a couple questions before we start.
all right,
The
I'm ready.
listeners can probably determine what we're going to talk about by the title of this episode. However, I might as well introduce it now. We're talking about Asian carp. Now, I will explain in a little bit how that name is not necessarily something that I personally think is an accurate representation of the different genera. But as for just the common tongue and appealing to as many people as possible, I'm going to start this out by saying, what do you know about Asian carp?
So, personally, Asian carp, when we started doing this, it rings a bell. It's definitely something that I can hear and I can think of it as being a problem and something that for sure in some ecology class at some point we talked about this being an issue. However, I am not very well versed in exactly very well versed, sorry, very well versed in exactly the role of these fish and how bad it really is. And especially I am from the western side of Canada, so I think in North America, it's mostly on the east, and for us, it's not really a problem. So, not a lot.
Yeah, I strategically mentioned the Great Lakes ecosystem earlier, and it wasn't just happenstance and a total accident that I'm happening to segue into now. But being that I do live within the Great Lakes ecosystem, it is one of the biggest invasive species that we are trying to prevent from entering the watershed up there. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that when we get into it. But I say we might as well get it going and let's start the first episode.
Let's get started.
So, a little bit of background. We're going to be talking about carp that are in the family Cyprinidae, and I'm going to rifle off the genus and species names right here for most of them. We'll only be focusing on 2 of the main ones, but there are 4 introduced species that are mainly talked about when we're referencing Asian carp. And this is the Hypophthalmichthys species. I'm sorry, the Hypophthalmichthys genus, which includes H. nobilis, which is the bighead carp, and H. mollitrix, which is the silver carp. You also have the Mylopharangodon genus, which includes black carp, and the Tenopharangodon, Tenopharangodon idella, which is grass carp. And if you live in the Midwest, you've probably seen grass carp in retention ponds. These species were mainly introduced as algae, weed, and parasite controls in canals and ponds back in the 50s and 60s. And they didn't start necessarily becoming a big issue until the 70s and 80s. They may have been an issue before that, but it wasn't necessarily noticed until then. Basically, they have since escaped and are causing dramatic changes in the ecosystems where they have established. And to give you a little bit of an explanation of why we're only talking about the Hypophthalmichthys genus is because most of the literature that you're going to read and most of the invasive species information, it comes from these two species, which are the bighead and silver carp. So when I'm referencing information about the carp, unless otherwise specified, I'm probably referencing those two carp species. So to give you a little bit of a description of what these fish look like, imagine the general shape of a goldfish. Goldfish are carp, or if you're a fisherman or angler in any sense and you've seen carp, they have the general fish or the carp body. So they've got a central dorsal fin, anal and pelvic fins, and then slap some silver spray paint on that bad boy. Make sure your fish looks incredibly sad, and take those eyes and move them really far down the face, farther down than you're currently imagining, like uncomfortably low. And the barbels that you tend to see on the front of a lot of carp species, throw those away. There's no need for them here. These species of carp do not have them.
And just
and that is
remind
like
us, for people that are really bad with fish, barbels are the whiskers, right?
Yes, correct. Yes, those
Okay,
are.
just double checking.
So is now that you've got that beautiful picture of this gorgeous fish in your head, we can kind of talk about where they came from and their native habitat, because it's important to talk about with introduced species where they come from, so you can kind of get an understanding of why they're invasive and why they're so efficient and effective. So if we're focusing on the Hypophthalmichthys species like silver carp, they are threatened in their native range primarily due to overfishing, dam construction, and pollution. And this is cited as particularly through the Chinese part of their range. However, I would say that the Chinese part of their range makes up the vast majority of their range. So that's kind of a unnecessary bit of information. But figured I'd include it anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit.
Sorry,
Oh,
we're
go
looking
ahead.
at a species that is invasive and way too big of a population over here, but is actually endangered in its home range.
Correct. And I think
Okay.
that as we get more and more into episodes, we're going to see that that becomes kind of a trend among a lot of species. I'm looking at you, Burmese pythons. I mentioned that dams are one of the biggest kind of threats to their current status in their native habitat. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the Three Gorges Dam, which, if you've taken a sustainability course or environmental engineering, or look at any sort of like green being in quotations, energy, the Three Gorges Dam is referenced as one of the largest, if not the largest, hydroelectric generation projects in the world. And this is a massive dam. It spans approximately 1.4 miles, which is 2.24 kilometers across the Yangtze River. It can potentially produce 22.5 gigawatts of power. Now, I know that gigawatts is like kind of an arbitrary term for anybody who doesn't know how much of a frame of reference that much power is. But for your reference, there's a coal plant in Georgia, which is considered to be one of the largest in the world, that produces only 3.5 gigawatts of power. And that powers 1.4 million homes. So imagine what this hydroelectric dam in China could produce if it does actually produce 22.5 gigawatts of power. Now, I know that there is a lot of people saying that it doesn't necessarily function to produce that much power currently. It's still partially under construction, and it's not necessarily up to the most efficient running levels right now. And there's actually been a lot of problems within its development, as far as like how much power it's actually producing. And I don't necessarily know that they're releasing like specific figures of what it is actually producing at any given time. But I will say I didn't necessarily look that far into it. The only reason I'm bringing up this dam is because it has a lot of negative impacts that are associated with it that you wouldn't necessarily think from hydroelectric being what we would refer to as green energy. So some of the negative impacts that come from this dam is the reduced water flow downstream and the increased flooding and erosion upstream, which is basically how dams function. They stop the water flow, or not necessarily stop the water flow, but slow the water flow so that it backs up upstream, and then they can utilize that power to drive the generators and produce electricity. So the massive size of this and just how important the Yangtze River is in China, this sort of halting of the water has basically induced weather and climate impacts downstream. And there's reports that say it has displaced upwards of 1 million people and some up to like 1.4 million people. And of course, you have the reduction of sensitive plant and animal species that are surrounding the initial development of it, and also that are impacted because of the reduced water flow or the increased flooding. So you've got a lot of plant species that are being listed as endangered or extinct because of the development of this dam. Of course, when you build a massive project like this, something that's 1.4 miles long, you've got or 2.24 kilometers for people who aren't versed in freedom units. You've got a lot of environmental impacts directly around it. So you've got the housing for the likely hundreds, if not thousands, of employees that work there. You've got all of the places that they need to go for, to park their equipment, for food, for supplies and maintenance and all of that kind of stuff. And you've got any sort of like spills, oil spills just from trucks and stuff driving through there. So you've got a direct impact on the environment. Nothing is entirely green. So why bring this up and spend so much time on this? Well, the Yangtze River is in eastern China, which is right within the predominant range of all 4 species of the aforementioned quote unquote Asian carp. So you've got a direct impact on these fish species, as well as likely many, many other species, preventing them from really utilizing their natural habitats and moving up and downstream how they normally would.
I think a lot of people maybe, or at least a decent amount of people might be able to connect this to the Yangtze River dolphin is one of the big stories involving the dam. Or as well, it did come to mind as you started talking about the Three Gorges Dam. It was something that I wasn't sure I remembered, but I think people can think back, and at one point there was a lot of photos on the internet released of a city that was completely drowned by water by a dam, and this is the Three Gorges Dam there in China. So this displacement was huge, and yeah, there is a whole bunch of different organisms, but I actually didn't know that the carp were so negatively impacted too.
Yeah, they tend to prefer semi-turbulent streams that have relatively good oxygen quality. So immediately below a dam, you're going to get like excessive oxygen and other gaseous contents in like very, very high to lethal percentages. So that could also have a direct effect on the species. So their technical full range would be eastern Siberia through southern and central China, and obviously into eastern China as well. But currently, they have been introduced and are invasive in Europe, South America, and North America. And I want to say that they've been introduced to over 70 countries. And I thought at one point I did have a statistic on that. I do. They have been exported to over 70 countries. So that's not necessarily meaning that they are invasive in over 70 countries, but they are being exported into over 70 countries. So that's why there's such a global invasive presence. So they've also been introduced to most of the Indian subcontinent. So that's India, Pakistan, and most Southeast Asian countries, this is what I was talking about when I was referring to the phrase Asian carp, because it makes it sound like they're native throughout parts of Asia. But as I've obviously just described, that is not the case. And they are problematic in parts of Asia as well. I think that it's not necessarily an accurate description of the species. And personally, I do think it is probably better to delineate by species or even just genera, like the Hypophthalmichthys genera or genus, especially when there are so many negative connotations to the phrase invasive species. I think that tying it directly to a country makes it seem like it's that country's fault, and we can place a lot more blame on that, when that's not necessarily the case, because these are being exported and imported to these countries where they become invasive, and they're also being imported purposefully. So it's an intentional they're intentionally acquiring these species, and it's not necessarily the fault of their country of origin. And I think that the negative connotation that can come with delineating an invasive species by the country of origin is just not worth it, and you should just take the extra time to specifically talk which species you're talking about.
Right.
And that's my soapbox.
I think there, in general, maybe this is a bit of a sidebar, but there's a lot of problems with common names to do with a lot of different places where they're from or other things. But I know a lot of common names are being changed because of these reasons. But it's a complicated process. So we'll just have to stick with
That
it for
actually
now.
reminds me too, and your timing probably could not have been better. But and I briefly skimmed over it. But do you want to talk about maybe perhaps another reason that you sent me in an email this morning as to why the phrase Asian carp might be changed in the public eye?
Right. So actually, literally this morning, before we started recording, I pull up my National Geographic newsletter, and at the bottom there is a subheading name change and thinking about changing the name of the Asian carp. Now, interestingly, this is not related to the important problems that Nicholas brought up, but it's actually related to the food industry. Now, the problem is that Nicholas will get into this a little bit more later, I think, but these fish are definitely edible and they do eat them in some places, but people now have this negative association with Asian carp, not just as an invasive species, but as like a bottom feeder, right? So when you're in a supermarket or a restaurant and it says Asian carp, you're like, ew, no thanks, right? So they're actually thinking about trying to change the name. Now, they've actually done this before, the food industry. The examples that we were given here was the Patagonian toothfish. Does not sound appetizing
Delicious.
at all. Yeah, they changed that to the Chilean sea bass.
Oh,
Now, see that you can put on your
fancy.
plate. And the slime fish, very delicious,
Sounds like a booger.
exactly, became an orange roughy, which also just
That sounds less appetizing. If
it does
I think I'd
sound
rather eat a slime fish than an orange roughy.
an orange roughy. Yeah, it does sound a little bit weird
Rough.
as well, but better than slime fish. So just a super little interesting side note that popped into my inbox this morning. So yeah, common names can be changed. They go all over the place and for a whole bunch of different reasons. But anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I mean that's a general point to bring up in science too. Is common names can overlap between species, so it's always important to specify what you're talking about so that your intentions are not misconstrued or somebody thinks that you're talking about something completely different. So why and how were these species introduced? So you've got H. mollitrix, which was the silver carp, which was introduced for the control of algae, weeds, and parasites in canals and ponds. Due to flooding and obviously other means of them moving from a enclosed body of water to open streams and rivers and things like that, they have moved and established in many areas. H. nobilis, which is the big head carp, has been exported to over 70 countries primarily as a source of food. These fish are very prized and therefore they're often transported alive for their freshness. So this obviously increases the likelihood that they're going to escape and establish. Because if you're transporting dead fish and they get out, you're not going to have any fish that are living in that ecosystem. So now we're going to get a little bit into some of the issues that are caused directly by the presence of these fish in our ecosystems, or in the ecosystems that they are non-native to, is probably a better way to phrase that. So all species that I've mentioned thus far are effective filter feeders. They feed on zooplankton as larvae and then phytoplankton once they have reached an effective filtration size, which is a kind of almost backwards thinking, because generally we think of zooplankton as like a larger meal for something, and then phytoplankton are generally that primary source of food for a lot of like low trophic level species. But they're so small when they first come out of the, or when they first develop, that they feed on zooplankton before getting large enough to effectively filter the phytoplankton.
Right. So they kind of come along then and like have a little snack, like "Ow, ow," with the
Right,
zooplankton.
little munches, and then they breathe in their food,
Right. Okay.
which
So it's kind of from
explains the
going from
frown.
little bites into almost like quote unquote grazing for a fish.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. That's a great way of putting it. So these carp are capable of filtering particulate as small as 4 nanometers, which, for reference, one human hair is approximately 70 nanometers thick. So obviously they're filtering incredibly tiny particulate in the ecosystems, which means they're attacking the food source for an entire ecosystem directly at the bottom, the bare minimum, the smallest areas. And if it was a smaller organism feeding on that, then obviously it wouldn't make such an impact. But these fish get pretty large. They get like 20 to 80 pounds, which is 9 to 36 kilograms for reference. So imagine this massive silver tank of a fish and hundreds and thousands of its buddies just vacuuming up all of the smallest particles in an ecosystem.
Let's get it, boys.
Effectively, they're suffocating out these ecosystems from the bottom up. They don't have, actually. They completely lack a stomach, which is that they continuously feed because they don't have that digestive tract. It is likely that they lack a stomach because they continuously feed, and the particulate is so small that they don't necessarily need a very advanced digestive system, as you'd imagine if you're, eating particulate that is somewhere in the neighborhood of like a less than a tenth of a thickness of a human hair. Then you're not necessarily going to need a very advanced digestive system to break anything down because you're pretty much getting all of your nutrients directly from that small particulate. Another problem that is more of a direct impact on humans and things like that is when these carp are startled, they jump. I don't know if you've seen anything about this or you've seen videos. Have you ever seen videos from this?
I don't know if I have. Maybe if you explain it to me, then I can see if.
So I encourage anybody who has access to YouTube to go and Google jumping Asian carp. And the videos you will see are obscene. When they get startled, they fly up to the surface and they shoot like 10, 20, 30 feet through the air, just flapping their rigid bodies and slapping people in the face. But yeah, seriously, even the large carp.
That was a very surprised look for anybody.
Yeah.
For
her eyes got
listeners
very
here.
wide when she imagined a massive fish coming at her face. But yeah, hundreds of them are jumping all at once from boats that are cruising down the rivers, and people are getting hit in the face. People are having their skulls fractured. They're having their noses broken. They're getting like black eyes from these fish. And I didn't necessarily look it up, and I couldn't necessarily find anything off the top. I don't think anybody's been killed by these fish, but I would imagine that if you've got an 80-pound, 36-kilogram fish flying at your head through the air and you're on a boat and you get hit in the head, you're not going to have a very good day. So that's one of the scarier effects of these fish. And it does go to show that like even these like very more or less peaceful invasive species can be harmful to humans as well. On another kind of anthropomorphic or anthropocentric reasoning as to why they are causing issues is the commercial fishing competition. They obviously have that large size that we've been talking about, so they can pretty much outgrow most potential predators in these ecosystems, or at least any remaining natural predators in these ecosystems with relative ease. They grow very quickly. As you'd imagine, if you're constantly eating and constantly filtering out direct nutrients from an ecosystem, your growth rate is pretty fast. And I'll go into detail about that a little bit more in a little bit later. But these fish are suffocating out these ecosystems, and they're preventing these lower level filter feeders, these secondary feeders, from establishing and being able to compete. They're occupying a very specific niche and they're completely taking it over. and there's not much that the other species can do. So they end up just completely monopolizing ecosystems, which is obviously bad for the ecosystem. But as far as commercial fishing goes, of course, it's going to have further negative impacts on that. Their reproduction is obscene. Now, as somebody who has very, very little background in fish biology and things like that, I'm aware that a lot of fish produce a lot of eggs in clutch sizes and reproduce significantly, but I do not know if it is of this amount, because this seems staggering to me. And maybe Kirsten, you'll know a little bit more. But the research that I looked stated that a single female can produce upwards of 2 million eggs annually.
That seems pretty high to me. And I assume that they're like annual breeders as well. It's not like something that's salmon that goes ahead and dies afterwards.
I think they're more or less consistent breeders as far as like as long as the water parameters are met. So it's not like they just breed once a year. I think it's
Right.
there's multiple breeding cycles. And
Right.
as far as I know, it's not like, salmon where they die upon breeding or anything like that. I'm pretty sure they continue their life cycle.
Right. So you're getting these big fish that are really efficient at eating, super good at eating. Use up all of
I'm sorry, I
the
have to stop you right
resources.
there.
Yep.
Did you say that the fish are efficient at eating?
Oh God. Yes, they're very efficient. And there we have, ladies and gentlemen, our first horrible pun.
One of many to come.
One of many to come. So they're coming in here to the system. They're super efficient at eating. They grow really quickly and they reproduce really quickly. So this is just like all of the check boxes to push out other fish from the system.
Yeah, they're basically invasive species are invasive because they're able to suffocate out other species, overcome natural potential predators, and just effectively fill a niche gap in an ecosystem. And they hit all three of those on the head, and that is why they are so incredibly detrimental. We're going to focus on the Mississippi watershed, which is essentially, if you want to picture that, it's from the Midwest United States down into the Gulf of Mexico is basically where the Mississippi runs. And all its tributaries and things like that. So it's a massive, massive area. Most of the agricultural land around there is in the U.S. is around that watershed area. And of course, you have the Great Lakes ecosystems at the tops, which the Asian carp have been working their way up to for years and years and years now. And the preventative measures have been implemented to prevent them from getting up there. Imagine that, preventative measures prevent them from getting up there. Wow, deep
That's
deep
all right.
thoughts
We just have to make
here.
sure that we're really sure that it's being preventative.
Right.
Which is actually a good point to highlight, because a lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of our governments and things are not very good at being preventative, and they're better at being reactive. So, I mean, at least there's that.
Yes,
and
that's very true.
However,
However, I would have you hold that back, because I'm going to explain that most of the preventative measures that worked were accidental.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get into that.
So it was. I'll explain it in a little bit, but yeah, don't give the U.S. government as much credit as you're giving it.
Okay, I'll make sure to be skeptical.
Thank you. I admire that skepticism. So, a population study done by Sass et al. In 2009 was a mark recapture study, and it puts estimates at approximately 2,544 carp per river kilometer in the Illinois River. And for my American listeners, that's 1,579 fish per mile. So this is just within the surveyed area of the Illinois River, which is the main river under siege by these invasive fish that goes right into the Great Lakes watershed. So also in that study, it was found that populations made up 51% of the total fish species during the survey. So when they were doing these mark recapture surveys, over half of the species that they pulled up were Asian carp. That's insane. Aquatic ecosystems have some of the most diverse fish species or diverse fauna species. Like, you don't see that type of diversity anywhere else. And you never ever see like one fish species monopolizing an ecosystem like that. So to have these invasive carp be 51% of the surveyed fish in this area is insane, and goes to show just how much of an impact they're making on these ecosystems.
Right. They're just not even giving it a chance to the other guys.
Right, exactly. So we're going to talk a little bit about where it's the worst. I kind of hit on it talking about the Mississippi River Basin, which is obviously, like I said, Gulf of Mexico up through the Midwest, and show negative impacts of invasive species carp, Hypophthalmichthys, on native species. So a study by Phelps et al. In 2017 specifically references the impacts on planktonivores. So this study analyzes 20 years of data collection and looks at correlations between silver carp presence and native fish decline. The study specifically focuses on bigmouth buffalo and gizzard shad, which are two fantastic names for fish. Just absolutely fantastic fish.
Just rocking names. I'm a fan.
Right. And just for specificity's sake, planktonivores are things that eat like phyto and zooplankton and things like that. Very small organisms. They're secondary consumers, which are very low level consumers.
Yeah, the guys competing for the same food as the carps.
Right, exactly. So that's that niche that the carp are currently monopolizing. And the research basically confirmed that the silver carp are definitely occupying the niche habitat of these consumers, which would show a direct correlation between the presence of Asian carp and the decline of those two planktonivore species, which is expected, but also disappointing. Because sometimes ecosystems are more hardy than we give them credit for sometimes, and sometimes they can adapt to big, huge, massive changes, even massive population increases in species, especially those ecosystems that have been affected by human development and may have open niches for invasive species to occupy. But obviously that is not necessarily the case here, and they are having a very negative impact on it. So I think that this is probably a good time to take a little break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about what is being done and what are some of the preventative measures that are being taken against the spread of these Hypophthalmichthys genus species in the Illinois River.
Right. I'm looking forward to hearing about some accidental successes from a possibly competent, possibly incompetent government.
Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
Welcome back. So, as we discussed in the first half, we kind of talked about where the species of carp have come from, where these invasive carp have been introduced, and all of the problems that they're coming. Now we are going to discuss the preventative measures. Some of these are incredibly ingenious to horrifically comedic, and I'll break down as many of them as I can, as much detail as possible, given our general time constraints. So the main one, as I referenced before, is electric barriers. So these electric barriers have basically been tested with very positive results. And this is kind of where Kirsten and I had talked about the American government stepping in preventatively, but that wasn't necessarily the case. There was an invasive goby that was working its way up to the Great Lakes ecosystem, and the American government decided that it was important to prevent this goby from getting up there. However, they took too long to build the electric barriers, and it unsuccessfully stopped the goby from getting up there. However, it did partially successfully prevent the Asian carp from getting up there. And after it was seen that these barriers did work on the Asian carp, the intensity of them was increased fivefold. And I'll explain a little bit about how these electric barriers work. But The fivefold increase in their power basically has completely and effectively stopped Asian carp up until all recent studies from entering the Great Lakes ecosystem. As of now, there are no detected breeding populations within the Great Lakes that I could find. So there's a caveat there because my research might be incorrect. But the last article I remember reading was that they did basically a DNA analysis of the water in several of the Great Lakes to see if they could pick up any DNA for any Asian carp. And I do not believe that there was enough to signify that there was a breeding population within the lakes, though there have obviously been sightings and potential individuals caught and things like that. There's not any real literature to suggest, to my knowledge, that they have effectively made their way up into the Great Lakes. So how do these electric barriers work? So I am not an electrical engineer, so I'm going to try and break this down for you as best as I could understand it. There's electrodes that are submerged in water, and they basically pulse voltage throughout the water, creating an electric field across a section of river. So the entire stretch of this river is basically electrified, and that prevents the fish from going in. The pulse width can be adjusted to prevent the passage of larger or smaller fish. So it could prevent larger fish from entering while allowing smaller fish to go, and vice versa. However, because there's such a massive size gap in the differences of juvenile versus adult Asian carp, or I'm sorry, invasive carp, I don't necessarily think that they are varying the pulse to exclude any species of fish. I do believe that they are implementing these electrical barriers in a way that prevents basically any fish from entering or leaving the Great Lakes ecosystems through the tributaries that are outfitted with these electrical barriers. That being said, not every single entrance and exit to the Great Lakes is being outfitted with these electrical barriers. They're not shutting down the ecosystem or preventing anything from going in. They're just targeting the main ones where there's a high presence or detected presence of these invasive carp species.
Right. Now I have a question quickly. Now
Go
this
ahead.
coming from these tributaries into the Great Lakes, that is upstream, correct?
For the most part, yes.
most part,
The Mississippi watershed does have rivers and tributaries that move in pretty much all sorts of directions. But for the most part, the fish are moving north towards the Great Lakes ecosystem, Great Lake
Right.
ecosystems.
Right. And against the current, like upriver.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Because
For
I
all
think
intents and purposes, yes.
essentially if you have like this electric barrier, if the fish come into it and they get shocked, then they'll essentially just float back down the river until they come back into consciousness, right?
Yeah, it's more of a deterrent than a like shocking and stunning method. So it's more of a okay, we're not going to go this way because it's disrupting the electrical signals that we use to navigate. So
Yeah.
they may be unable to navigate through there. It's essentially to them might look like a wall. So it looks as if there's no passage possible. And that's essentially where my knowledge on it stops. I don't know if the frequency is able to be adjusted per species where it affects species or if it's just based on size of fish, because my research suggests that it's based on the size of fish, but that research was done on gobies versus Asian. And when I say my research, I don't specifically mean my research. I mean me reading studies done, actual other people's research. I don't want people to think that I've done actual research on Asian carp, or at least nothing that's been published.
Right.
So the idea is essentially that the introduction of Asian carp could be so detrimental to native biota and fisheries in the Great Lakes that complete biological exclusivity via these electrical barriers is probably the most viable means of preservation. That is to say that rather than having the fish get up there and establish by possibly letting in other fish species, they'd rather exclude everything because it could just collapse the ecosystem otherwise.
Right. So unfortunately, you're kind of fragmenting this habitat then for all the fish species, but it ends up being worth it because we just can't have the Asian carp into the system.
Absolutely. And like I
Okay.
mentioned, not every single entrance is locked down. As far
Yeah,
as long as the Asian carp are pretty much confined to like the Illinois River seems to be the primary problematic area, then they're not going to be adding additional barriers. There have been additional construction. That's not to say that there hasn't been, but essentially they're probably not going to lock down the entire Great Lakes ecosystem because that would obviously have its own detrimental effects to the commercial fishing industry as well.
of course.
um, to combat the increased introduction of species into areas where they haven't necessarily established. The U.S. banned importation of bighead carp in 2010. As far as I know, though, that's the only. It was very specific to the ban of bighead carp, which is that is that H. Molitrix or is that the other one? I can't remember now. Of course.
I can't even
No,
pronounce
H.
it. So.
nobilis. Yeah, H. nobilis is the big head carp. It was very specific to that species, primarily because that was used as a food source. I don't necessarily know nor think they have banned the introduction of other species because I know for a fact that to this day, grass carp are still used as algae and other biologic control in retention ponds and things of that nature, even as far as in the natural areas that I manage today. People tend to use these invasive carp species because they are such effective filter feeders, but also because of the fact that they're filter feeders, they don't bite bait. So if you were to use the native species of carp or catfish or things of that nature, anglers would be able to remove them from the water and they would not be as effective as a species of fish that continuously reduces contaminants as well as doesn't get fished out. That being said, there are still biological collapses causing these ecosystems. Anecdotally, we actually had a carp collapse a few years ago in one of the natural areas where hundreds, if not thousands, of carp that were in these ponds just completely died because of a bacteria infection. And there's also instances in which millions of carp die throughout a river. So that is actually one of the explored control methods is these bio bullets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into some more specific management strategies in a little bit here. So on top of banning the importation of bighead carp in 2010, a lot of places are creating flood barriers, which is essentially just miles of concrete slabs, similar to what you see dividing highways if you ever drive down them. I obviously can't speak for other countries, but in the U.S. we have the triangular prism-shaped concrete slabs that are there's just miles and miles of them used to prevent fish from being carried into streams during flood events and things like that.
Okay.
Which, as you can imagine, was probably got some negative effect on animal movement and things like that in of itself. So,
Right. There's always a catch-22 for sure.
right, exactly.
Unfortunately.
And I wanted to talk about this a little bit, just briefly, because it's just so ridiculous to me. But one of the control methods that's being used is as a tourist attraction. And Kirsten just showed me a video like during our break. And what was it? Is it scarping?
Scarping, yes. I did quickly look up a video to try to look at the carp jumping because that's something that I hadn't really seen. And I came across scarping, which I would love for you to give us a nice colorful picture of what that is.
Okay, so before I talk about scarping, I have to talk about something else. So picture this. You've got two guys sitting backwards off of a motorboat flying down a river. Now, the motorboat is running full speed down the river and it is being as loud as possible to basically encourage the carp to jump up out of the water. Now, the two people sitting on the back are holding bows with strings attached to them because they are attempting to shoot the Asian carp out of the air and then pull them back into the boat. And then the one who gets the biggest carp or the most carp is the winner. Now, I mean, this is just a a thought process in my mind, but if you shoot an arrow attached to like a string that's probably got some elasticity to it and you miss, which I imagine most people are most times, is there not like a chance that that just like rubber bands back at them at high speed? Because that would be my greatest fear, is that I go to shoot a carp out of the air and then the arrow returns and pierces my heart, or I take an arrow to the knee or something.
I don't think it's quite that elastic. You'd have to have a pretty strong elastic force to get an arrow to come all the way back to you. But I guess, is it an extreme sport if you're not potentially going to be impaled?
It's not a sport if it's not stupid. Not in America.
I didn't say
Um,
that.
I'm talking about obscure sports here. Please don't at me, sports ball fans. So, scarping, as I understand it, is essentially wakeboarding, skiing, surfing, etc. behind a boat in the same exact scenario and trying to net and dunk the fish into a basket for points. Of course, because safety is always third, you wear a helmet, a football helmet, and generally are outfitted in pads and a life vest for when inevitably an 80-pound, 37-kilogram fish smacks you in the face and knocks you out.
Safety first, kids.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
is incredible. If you guys just want to go ahead and take 2 seconds and check this out, you can find photos and videos of it pretty quickly.
I would go as far to say as that we will include a link to a scarping video in our show notes for this episode, because if you take nothing else from this episode, just please bask in the glow of American ingenuity that is skiing behind a motorboat and catching invasive fish out of the air. That is poetry. So now I'm going to get into some preventative measures that are either being implemented or are in the process of research and development. And these are some more technical things that aren't necessarily used as on such a wide scale. These are going to be primarily focused on eradication methods, but I do have some more preventative measures in there as well. So I think I mentioned at the very beginning that super oxygenating water will kill carp. And a study done by Cow et al. In 2016 stated that supersaturation of dissolved gases into an ecosystem kills Asian carp above 140% saturation completely. It is a 100% kill rate above 140% oxygen saturation. There are also studies done to show that CO2 increases in the water can kill off Asian carp. However, both of these, I would say that the drawback to them could be that it kills native fish as well. But it is important to remember that during eradication processes, that sometimes a species is so invasive and it's such a monopolized presence, or has such a monopolized presence in an ecosystem, that eradication methods aren't going to necessarily be super detrimental to native species, because there's not really that many native species remaining. So it's not, none of these are write-off because they might be detrimental to invasive or to native species, excuse me.
Right. And the hope there too is that you can eradicate this invasive species enough, and then in theory the native species should be able to recolonize that place once they're not being pushed out anymore, correct?
Absolutely, yes. With obviously other introduction efforts. It's essentially focused on the first step.
Right.
Is this going to effectively eliminate the pest or the invasive species? And then is this the only option? And post eradication, they're not going to be implementing that same process as much. They're going to be doing other preventative measures to prevent the reintroduction and the explosion of population that caused that ecosystem to be in harm's way in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the bio bullets that I was talking about, which is it's kind of ridiculous and seems a little far-fetched science fiction to me right now as far as its actual efficacy and implementation. But essentially you're creating nanoparticles filled with poison to target specifically this fish. These poisons might be like endocrine disruptors or something that only target the invasive carp species. So these bio bullets are filled with these toxins that would only affect Asian carp. And it's only in its developmental and research phases. There is no concrete conclusions that have currently been developed. And a lot of people suggest that the introduction of these new chemicals in any sort of capacity, even like targeted endocrine disruptors, could have detrimental environmental consequences that we don't necessarily know the effects of. Even if it doesn't have a direct effect on species immediately, mass releasing toxins or poisons into ecosystems is obviously not going to be beneficial in the long run in some way. So that one might be less of a viable solution.
Right. In progress. Yep.
Yes. Another method is deploying curtains of bubbles or annoying noise to drive them away.
Want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?
I'm trying to like put this into like a way that it makes sense. So I guess picture this. So these bubble curtains are like, imagine if you've ever owned an aquarium and you just keep fish and you have one of those little LED air stones in your tank. Now supersize that to like 40 feet long, add flashing strobes and disruptive sounds, and then stick that underwater.
Mount Wanahakalugi.
The sound and bubble curtains, they're pretty much able to deter a selective target. Like they're able to deter Asian carp without overall effects on other taxon. And this is a study who, for whatever reason, I didn't necessarily look up because it wasn't published. I don't have a cited source for it because the study was done, but it was never published. It says under publication and under peer review right now, but it was done in 2014.
Okay.
And so it's odd to me that I couldn't find the article itself. So I would say that this study that I'm referencing specifically right now, I would say take with a grain of salt because it currently has not been published or gone through full peer review. But it essentially said that these bubble curtains were completely effective at deterring the Asian carp without effects on other species, meaning that maybe the carp for some reason are more responsive to the presence of these bubbles and sounds and frequencies that they're using than other native fish. But that's a pretty bold claim to have, and then to not have a publication with it does make it a little, as the kids say, sus. So I would think that might be something to look into to see if that ever gets published, or just to see if anybody else is continuing with this research, or where that research went, because I think it seems to me like it could be more effective and more or more viable than the electric barriers without being as detrimental to native species. So I think that's pretty cool.
Well, if we're talking about these carp they jump out of the water and they seem to be kind of scared easily, perhaps their behavior is to be more flighty than other fish. Like, this is just me speculating, of course, but if you tie that behavior together, then definitely something worth looking into more later on.
No, I think that's a great point to make, because obviously, like, they are responsive to sound and things like that, and they're clearly disturbed by it. And it's probably not necessarily that they're scared by it. If they're running and jumping out of the water as much as possible, it's probably that these frequencies are disrupting their ability to properly move or causing them to enter a state of like panic. So the bubble curtains and sound generators could be a more effective way to deter specifically Asian carp without affecting the sensitive native species.
Right.
So that's a good conclusion.
I think I'm most speculative about whether it doesn't impact the other fish. Like, I can see this bubble curtain being very effective. Like, you look at dolphins that hunt in this way, right?
Yes.
That they like circle around and create bubbles to trap fish and those kind of things. But yeah, the not affecting the other fish is something that we can definitely would need to be confirmed.
Quick aside, dolphins are dope. Like all species of dolphins, they're just so intelligent.
in
If
case you
we can
guys didn't
somehow
know.
work, if we could work dolphins into every episode of this podcast, I would not be disappointed.
All right, might be a
Um,
little hard for the next one, but I'll do my best.
So, okay. So this last one is actually a method that I've used, not necessarily for control of Asian carp, but for research purposes and fish data collection. So I'm gonna phrase it the way that it was phrased on the website that referenced the study that was done on this, but it was firing jolts of electricity from a backpack ray gun. And so in my mind, I am picturing a Ghostbusters pack on the back of some scientist just on a front of a boat like Ahab and just shooting bolts of laser beams into the water and electrocuting these fish. Upon actual research, I couldn't find anything regarding ray guns, so I was very disappointed, and my sci-fi nerd side was pretty sad to find that out. And my only conclusion that I could make with this is that they're not necessarily talking about ray guns, but I think they're just talking about the backpack mounted transformers that you use to put current into the water to
For
stun fish
electrofishing.
for fish surveys. Yeah.
Right.
Like,
Okay. Just electrofishing.
yeah, I'm
All
like
right.
almost certain that's exactly what it is. And like they just were like somebody saw a picture of one and was like, ray gun. So hey, you know what? Power to the Ghostbusters fan that saw that and put that on that article. But I could not find any research to support the fact that there are actual ray guns out there, which yeah, we can put some depressing music in right now to signify that that isn't happening yet.
The proton pack is not a toy.
Moment of silence for the Ghostbuster fish ray gun.
Right, yeah, a moment of silence for Ghostbuster fans around the world. So essentially, I'm thinking that the proposed application for this electrofishing technology is that they utilize these methods to stun the fish, and then they just collect the invasive fish. For those of you who don't know the electrofishing methodology, do you want to explain it, Kirsten? Because it sounds like you have a fair idea of it, and I'm also starting to lose my voice.
Yeah, no worries. So I've never actually electrofished because it's actually quite an intensive and very expensive course to do so. But I've been on fish rescues where people have been using these. And essentially, the person running it has a large Ghostbuster looking backpack, which essentially has a current on it. And they walk along in the water with these long rods that essentially electrocute the fish on just enough to stun them. So these fish become stunned and float to the top of the water. And they're just stunned for a few moments, actually. And then they're collected in buckets or in whatever you have ready. And then they can be released and they're perfectly fine. So when I saw this is actually sometimes in canals, like a bunch of fish get trapped and then before winter, all the water runs out. So we were collecting the fish like this, but it's super interesting, and a lot of people use it for a lot of different fish surveys, and it's definitely been found to not be harmful for the majority. Afterwards, of course, there's always fish that could have complications, but then yeah, you can essentially just electrocute and stun these fish. And I guess with the invasive ones, you just get them in a bunch of buckets, and whether you're taking them to somewhere else or if you are going right away to euthanize them and eat them or dispose of them, I guess that's a different story.
The next section that we'll be discussing is actually some of the post-control methods and utilization of these massive fish bodies. So that's a good segue in like 2 minutes after I finish wrapping up the other methods. So just quickly touching on some of these other methods. Dispelling Asian carp with water guns. Now, this is not, unfortunately, some guy standing on the front of a boat with a super soaker spraying the fish away. These are usually like jets mounted, like fixed jets mounted in places on either side of the river to create current to prevent the fish from moving upriver. There's also the use of pheromones to drive fish away or specifically attract them to areas where they can easily be killed. So it might be used in conjunction with other methods that we've discussed. And finally, genetically altering the Asian carp's eggs so that their offspring are sterile. Now, this is a pretty common practice for a lot of invasive species management. And I don't think that we have the time nor the resources to discuss it in depth right now. But I will say that that is something we should probably talk about in the future. And there's probably a better species example to use for that as well. So I would stay tuned for that.
Absolutely.
One final anecdote before we get into what are we doing or what do we do with all of these thousands of tons of dead carp. Somebody is going to be like, oh, well, what about alligator gar and natural predators like other gar species and things like that? This is a point that has been brought up and made headlines recently, relatively recently, that the introduction of alligator gar is intended to kill Asian carp because their stomach contents have been analyzed and they do predate Asian carp. Let me just dispel any sort of idea that that is a potential solution. It's really, really unlikely, and it is unfortunate because alligator gar, for those of you who don't know, are like 10 to 15 foot long, massive, long nosed, super large toothed native fish to Illinois that were eradicated because they were scary looking. And now they're being reintroduced into the Illinois River. And there has been shown that they do prey on Asian carp. That being said, it's very unlikely that even like a large and established population would be successful at eradicating these fish because of the sheer number of Asian carp, and they have much quicker life cycles. It could take 40 to 50 years for an alligator gar to reach a point where it could successfully predate a 2-year-old carp. So that being said, there's so many limiting factors into why that wouldn't work. Mainly the quantity of alligator gar you would need to consume that many fish and control the population is unsustainable in the ecosystem. And yet some people might say, oh, there'll be a population explosion. They'll reach their carrying capacity and they'll go down it. It's unlikely. Also, the age it requires alligator gar to grow to that level is not going to be compatible with how quickly these Asian carp are reproducing. And moreover, the fact that alligator gar are not doing well in Illinois, they're having to be reintroduced, and there's not necessarily even anywhere near a strong enough population to even put any sort of semblance of a dent in the populations of Asian carp. As amazing and cool as that would be, it's not something that's going to be viable. Now, it could be something with, time and efforts and reduction of the invasive carp overall that they might be able to use as supplementary management in like small areas or these small tributaries and canals and things like that, where maybe it's just like reduce control and preventative methodology. But as a solution to the problem, any article that says that is the case is not doing its research properly. And I think that that's something that should be drawn up with the recent media boom of everybody freaking out over these alligator gar being reintroduced, thinking it's going to attack them for some reason.
Right,
Which,
okay.
by the way, there is no sort of like evidence to suggest that would be something that would happen anyway. So
Okay, so it definitely
after
doesn't
that-
hurt, but they're not
Right,
gonna,
exactly.
They're not going to go ahead and solve the problem.
Right. As cool as it would be to have massive, like almost 20-foot long, like alligator like fish in northern Illinois or in Illinois would be fantastic, and I would love it. It's not gonna happen. They will take like 100 years to grow to that size. So we've got a long way coming, and I'm well past. I'm not going to be 128 years old and see my first large gar. I'll tell you that much right now. So what do you do with all of the biomass? Because obviously a lot of these preventative measures and eradication measures are effective insofar as they produce high yields of eradicated fish. So the main reasons or the main uses of them is going to be fertilizer, fish meal, fish oil, and things like that. Fish byproducts that we standardly use other fish. Generally, we use native fish for, but there's no reason we couldn't use these invasive carp species. It's also exported to China. Obviously, there is a demand in China because they're exported, or they were originally exported from there. But since their populations aren't doing so well, we can now supplement their population loss with our additional population. So that's a massive score for the food industry, specifically in China. Now, I didn't talk about this so much, so I think it's worth talking about. The Asian carp, you mentioned this, Kirsten, but the carp are rumored to not taste very good. Now, as we stated, the silver carp is not necessarily exported for food, or at least my research, or the researching that I did didn't yield anything to suggest that. It was all on the big head carp. And with silver carp being the most prominent, there might be it might not be as tasty. But that being said, I have had fish balls. I regret phrasing it that way now that I've said it out loud.
Fish balls made with.
I have had balls of fish. That's not as bad. So if you've ever had like fried catfish, you know that it kind of tastes like where it is. And catfish are also these kind of detritivores, like quote unquote bottom of the river feeders, and they taste kind of muddy. If you don't fry catfish, then you get that kind of muddy taste. But once you fry them, like it's completely passable. It's hardly noticeable at all. And a lot of people really, really do enjoy the taste. There's a massive demand for catfish fries down south and stuff like that. But there's a lot of negative connotation that comes with these invasive carp, which to me doesn't make much sense, because if you fry something, I'm going to be honest with you, it pretty much tastes the same. Fried chicken, fried fish, fried Oreos, maybe not so much that one, but if you've had fried fish, you pretty much just taste the batter and stuff. You don't get much of the aftertaste of the fish. And big head carp is reportedly to have like a pretty sweet taste. And silver carp fish balls are pretty good. To me, they taste like your average fried fish. I don't know if it's necessarily one person who came up with this, but essentially, instead of taking the fish as a fried fillet, like you traditionally will do with catfish or like cod or tilapia or something like that, you kind of ground it up into like a paste, and then you batter and deep fry that. And apparently that helps improve the taste a little bit. But obviously, it's essentially an untapped market for food. And you can get tourism because of that. You have a supply of more or less unregulated fish, because there's not limits. What you're doing if you're collecting these fish is being more or less beneficial to the ecosystem. So if we are able to create a demand for these fish in the food industry or the fish products industry, it's going to naturally explode, because they're introduced and they're not native. They're not beneficial to these ecosystems that they are in. So that is potentially the most effective way that we have at managing these species, is getting them to be involved in both tourism and food industries. And I think that is pretty much a good way to wrap up this episode with regards to the only thing that we have remaining, which is the debate round.
Right. All right. So essentially, money makes the world go round. If we can make that work, we can get it going.
Bingo.
So if you guys haven't, head out and try yourself some Asian carp, or
go eat some fish balls. Oh wait, hold on. We can do a quick ad. Fish balls coming to a river near you. This episode is brought to you by Fish Balls. Pop one in your mouth and you'll never stop popping. Okay, so we're going to jump into the final segment of our show, which is what we call the debate round. Now, it's not necessarily what we would consider a traditional debate. We are just using this as someone playing a devil's advocate to demonstrate and dispel some of the popular criticisms that come with invasive species removal. So essentially, the person who did not have the opportunity to do research on this is going to play the devil's advocate. And then the person who is more well-versed in the given subject will combat the common criticisms with information that they have researched throughout this podcast. So without further ado, Kirsten, would you like to take us away?
All right. So, yes, you've given us a lot of points for why these fish are bad. However, we did introduce them on purpose, and we did so in most places so that they could clean up algae and help with water quality control. And so having these big populations is actually going to make for nicer, cleaner ponds and rivers in a bunch of areas. So isn't that, at the end of the day, more of a positive thing?
I would say that the direct effect of that is a more positive thing. Yes, you are getting the direct results of the increased water quality, the reduced algae, and things like that. However, we currently have native fish that do that job, and they do that job without sacrificing other elements of the ecosystem. If you only have introduced carp in these ponds, you're not necessarily fulfilling the ecosystem services that you would be fulfilling if you would just use native control reasonings. To further that a little bit more, most of the reasoning why we need these additional algae and filtration means is because we have destroyed the ecosystem themselves through our own development and addition of chemicals and poisons and things like that, to where we need additional help, which is why we look to invasive species. That being said, we've done so much research now that we know that they're more detrimental than beneficial.
Right. So at the end of the day, it just comes back to us fixing the root of the problem instead of trying to bring something in to make it better.
Correct. Rather than
All right.
addressing the root, we just add a bigger problem.
Right. That is a problem.
Mhm.
All right. So point number 2 then, which is just what we ended off with eating these introduced carp. They're super quick reproducing. They grow really fast and they grow huge. So this is a huge potential biomass for the fish market. We have a lot of places that are having a bit of a food crisis. You know, we have more and more people all the time, and these mouths need to be fed. So having these big populations of Asian carp can be really good, especially because if they're making up like 50% of the biomass and we eradicate those and the rest of the stuff doesn't catch up, then maybe it's just better to have them there for food purposes.
Yeah. So essentially, it's important to remember that these fish are putting stress on the current food industry as far as fish in the Great Lakes ecosystems go. So if we were to choose to remove them and reduce that stress, we would have higher populations of fish. This goes for, the fish entering and leaving the ecosystems or the Great Lakes ecosystems where their populations are being reduced due to the presence of this. And on top of that, if we were just to put less stress on the fishing industry ourselves, because most fishing is holistically unsustainable, it would probably be beneficial in that way to just kind of implement more of a reserved, sustainable approach to fishing within the Great Lakes on top of their overall eradication. The point about collapsing an ecosystem and having 50+% of the biomass completely decimated, because they are so invasive, it's pretty much impossible to just absolutely eradicate and destroy them completely. 49% of the ecosystem is probably going to be able to recover from that. But even if it wasn't, the managed and chronological eradication of species rather than universal kill-all methods would allow native species to recover as population densities of invasive carp are slowly reduced over time through management strategies.
Right. So it's not like we have a lot of fish now and just tomorrow we're going to have no fish at all if we get rid of them. It's a gradual thing to help the natural population bounce back.
Right, exactly. And obviously there are situations where this has occurred. In Kentucky, there was a massive carp die-off that came with, I believe, a bacterial infection. Killed millions of carp. The ecosystem's doing fine. And, well, I will say the ecosystem, the native ecosystem, was not necessarily harmed by that die-off, with the exception of probably the bioaccumulation of all that dead detritus from all the millions of fish. Other than that, the invasive carp population was able to reestablish anyway. So it's not feasible to completely eradicate. You can't just snap your fingers and have them vanish. And so it's there are opportunities for ecosystems to recover in those situations, even under extreme eradication methods.
Right. All right. Yeah, I think those were the main points to definitely bring up, and I think you cleared them pretty well, and I think that's mostly a wrap. What about you?
I think so too. I think this was a good first episode. And again, guys, remember, this is our first episode. We are still very awkward. That might never change for me, but we're still new to this. So give us criticisms. Don't be mean. I cry enough as it is. Kirsten's really tough, but I can't handle excessive criticism. So be kind when you criticize us, but seriously, give us some helpful
Pointers.
advice, or tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like. And yeah, we hope you guys like this first episode, and we hope you tune into our next one.
Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media, and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.